Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share a recent installment from our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series we call Office Hours, featuring Scott Miller. Scott teaches two classes here at the Darden School of Business, a class about financial crises, as well as a class about Alexander Hamilton. It was really fun to catch up with him, talk more about his background, as well as these courses. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. As always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check that subscription for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Scott Miller. Well, welcome, everyone. My name is Brett Twitty. I'm a member of the Darden Admissions Committee and your host for this office hours session. So pleased to be joined today by Scott Miller. Scott teaches a couple classes here at the Darden School. He's a historian by training, and so excited for this conversation today. As we always share for these office hours conversations, we've got some questions prepared. We'll probably spend the first third of the conversation getting to know Scott, his background, what brought him to Darden. Kind of middle third will be about classes that he's teaching here. And then maybe the final third, maybe some of the things he's working on, and maybe some questions from the audience. So if you do have questions as we go along, please feel free to ask via the Q&A. Well, I'll do my best to keep an eye on it as we go. We always get more questions than we're able to get to, but so appreciate your engagement. So appreciate your joining for this conversation. As always, we are recording this conversation. We'll plan to share the video on our Vimeo channel, as well as the audio on our admissions podcast, Experience Darden, as well as the Exec MBA podcast. So Scott, start with the same first question in all these conversations. So tell us who you are. Tell us a little bit more about your background.
Absolutely. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us from literally all over the world. Whenever I see something like that, it's just mind-blowing and wonderful. I am an assistant professor of business administration here at Darden. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. So right in the western suburbs, right up against the mountains, which is pretty amazing. My folks still live in the house I grew up in. And you step out the front door and you look about 200 yards to the right, there's the mountains right there. So pretty wonderful place to grow up. I went to undergrad in Southern California, just a little liberal arts school in Newport Beach, effectively. It was officially Costa Mesa, but across the street was Newport Beach. So that's what everybody knows. But then I went after undergrad. I came back to Colorado, and kind of a weird career path. I was a history and political science major, and I ended up for 4 years researching and writing books on World War II aviation. So what that means is I went to Europe and across the United States, effectively interviewing pilots and getting their journals and their photo albums and all that kind of stuff. So that was good training in a way, a little bit different from what I do now, but still good training. And then I went to grad school at here at UVA in the history department. So I'm a trained historian, as Brett said, but specifically in economic and financial history. And then I went to my first job was at the Yale School of Management. So I spent 2 years in New Haven, and then thank God got the chance to come back to UVA in 2021. So I've been very, very happily here ever since.
Scott, what got you interested in history?
That's a good question. I was thinking about this over the last few days, and to be perfectly honest, I am not certain. I was trying to nail down an exact reason or something that happened to me, and I can't really find it. I think the closest I came to is the realization from when I was really young that people's personal histories were absolutely fundamental in shaping what they did. So whether that be my parents, especially my grandparents, they weren't just my grandparents who lived in Denver, Colorado. It's like they had very specific series of events and actions and histories that influenced how they got to where they are and, why they were sitting in a chair watching a baseball game with me. And so that was pretty obvious to me from a young age. And then when I was 10 years old, I had the chance to go to Ukraine And this was relatively soon after the wall came down. And that was just kind of a massive slap in the face that, these people are just like me. For reasons that is a longer story than we have time to tell. At 10, I spent a lot of time in kind of like dorm rooms playing chess with college students, and hearing them talk about the history of the Cold War um made me realize that like perceptions of history not only shape who people are, but they can be wildly different. And so to me, that kind of those two things put together kind of shaped it. But I can't point to one particular moment or a book I read or anything like that that catalyzed it for me.
What about economic history was interesting to you?
This I do know for sure. This one I can say. So I never really cared about anything economic or financial, like through childhood or high school or even in college. In fact, this is funny given what I do now, but the two worst grades I've ever received in my life were in freshman micro and macro. And I'm not going to say what they are, but let's just say they were very bad. Um, and I always kind of took pride in that in a weird way. It's like, oh, like I'm interested in other things, like money is base and it doesn't really matter. Um, and that lasted all the way through my undergrad education. But then right after I graduated, I just happened to be in London um on in late September of 2008. And I can remember it as clear as I am talking to you coming up out of the tube on the day that uh, Lehman crashed, and walking through the city of London. And the closest way I could describe it is I was seeing people who looked like I felt on 9/11, and I did not understand it at all. I knew something massive was happening in the world, but I didn't understand what it was. Um, and to me, I realize how problematic, because this is not just like abstract kind of money anymore. Like this is the thing that is going to shape like my foreseeable future. And I don't understand it. So from that moment on, literally, I would go interview pilots, and then I'd come back home and teach myself like finance and econ and read the books. And then obviously I had a lot more formal training when I got into grad school. But that was very certain for me.
In the note from our prep call, you consider yourself kind of an early Americanist. Did I have that?
Mm,
Do I have that right? What does
yeah.
that mean?
So, I mean, I think if you ask 100 early Americanists, you'll probably get like 95 different answers is the answer. But the way I think about it, it is the area around the American founding where Americans started seeing themselves as something different as opposed to British and colonial subjects, right? Where there starts to be the formation of an American-ness, whatever that means. And I think about that. We can talk about that. But the way I tend to think about it is about the 20 years before the American Revolution. Um, and then the 25, 30 years afterwards is where this kind of sense of Americanness is both emerging, but also kind of solidifying and changing and being debated. Um, and then at that point, kind of when we get to the end of that period, there's a relatively distinct Americanness that is very, very different from kind of the British and colonial past. Um, but that's what I would consider an early Americanist per se.
Here we are on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence,
We
and
are.
um, good time, and also in the wake of the Ken Burns American Revolution documentary. Good time to be an early Americanist.
Yeah, it's a great time. I would say it's always a great time to be an early Americanist, depending on who you're talking to. But to be perfectly honest, I haven't seen the Burns series, and I don't think I will, if I'm to be honest. This is not a critique of Ken Burns at all, but I'm not a big fan of his stuff. That's not a slight on the quality or anything like that. It's just not my thing, I suppose. Um, but also I think it's one of those things where I really don't like when history people just sit around and watch like a show or something and be like, oh my gosh, that's so inaccurate. Like it would, you know, it's like it's a television show. Let's grow up a little bit. But when it comes to this thing that I literally have spent like 15 years of my life and years, literally years reading through hundreds of thousands, if not millions of actual documents, it gets tough for me to not be that person, and I just don't want to be that person. So I'm a little too close to it, I would say.
That makes sense. I was just curious. I mean, it's obviously a big year at the University of Virginia with all of that. The Declaration of Independence very much connected to the founder
Yeah,
of the university, and
yeah,
so 250th very much on the mind of
yes.
the UVA too. So, how did you get to Darden? Obviously, you spent time at UVA as a student and wanted to come back to UVA, but how'd you get to Darden?
Yeah, it's a good question because the route that I took is rare, I think, to say the least. Like there are very few trained historians who go into work in business schools, and part of that is just by kind of the nature of the trainings are quite different. Um, but the way I got to Darden is more or less by the grace of the former dean, Bob Bruner, who is one of the greatest human beings in history, as far as I'm concerned. But essentially, what happened was I was working on kind of a first year grad seminar paper on something that have ended up publishing a lot about, which is the first financial crisis in American history, which is the Panic of 1791, which happens just a couple of years after independence. Well, after the Constitution, depending on how you want to frame that. Um, but just through a random coincidence, a professor in the history department knew Bob Bruner, who had just published his book on the Panic of 1907. And he said to Bob, who was dean at the time, there's this kid who's working on like financial crises. I think you might find it interesting. You guys should meet. So we ended up meeting kind of upstairs in the dean's office. And I had never been to a business school before. I had no idea what it was or how it worked. Um, but I was intrigued predominantly because of Bob. He was just an interesting guy because on one hand, he was a scholar, but on the other hand, he was a teacher's teacher. And to be very honest, you don't see that very often. Um, And so we started kind of chatting a little bit, and then he asked me if I wanted to start writing cases with him. I had never written a case. I had no idea what a case study was. Um, for those of you who know about case studies, like they are not supposed to have drafts that are 40 pages long, which was the first one I ever turned in. And Bob's gently but firmly was like, we need to cut this down a little bit. That's not going to work. So we began writing a bunch of cases together and doing some research together. And I started coming to his classes over here at Darden, and I was very intrigued by the mode of teaching and the mode of learning here at Darden, which is very, very different than I had ever seen before. And I liked it. And so by the end of my grad school, I was actually spending more time over here at Darden than I was over at the history department. I obviously then turned that into my first job being at a business school at the Yale School of Management. But then because of that experience and the way Darden was and the way Darden worked, I knew that if I ever got a chance, which is a big if, obviously, but if I ever got a chance, I desperately wanted to get back here. And luckily I did.
Yeah, Bob Bruner has been on Office Hours. Highly recommend that conversation to anyone. We had him on. I mean, be happy to have him on every week, honestly. But
Yeah.
we had him on after he had just published the second edition of his
Yeah.
book about the Panic of 1907, and It was truly a highlight. An incredible person, incredible leader of the business school, a legend in the
Yeah.
classroom. I mean, obviously, has written all kinds of books and cases. I mean, just cast such a shadow. And I can imagine that would make an impression on you if you had a chance to write cases with him. Can you
Oh
tell
my
us a little
gosh.
bit about the panic of 1791? I don't know anything about that.
Oh, absolutely. Strap in, people. We're going to go for about 4 hours here. Okay. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, it was so the Constitution of the United States is effectively comes into being, and the government after the Constitution is set up in 1789. The United States is coming out of a depression worse than that happened in the 1930s. A lot of people don't know that, but immediately after independence, literally, we sink into a depression that, depending on the metrics you use, we're talking like net 35-40% GDP loss over about 6-7 years. I mean, catastrophic. Um, Alexander Hamilton, who I think we'll talk about in a little bit, essentially begins to reform the American financial system. And out of the creation of the new Bank of the United States, an asset bubble in U.S. government securities, new U.S. government securities, and essentially the stock. It was script, but the stock of the Bank of the United States goes from $25 at the issuance on July 4th to $325 on August 11th or 12th, depending on what city you're talking about. Subsequently, the market completely crashes and loses about 50% of its value in a day. And essentially, Alexander Hamilton has a weekend, August 13th and 14th of 1791, to develop a plan to kind of save the collapse of the new American financial system. Lucky for us, he does, through a series of strikingly modern interventions, including broad-based liquidity injections, working with merchants and bankers to kind of forestall liquidations. He closes what was the stock market for a period of time, so you can have kind of like a circuit breaker. And then there's lots of other stuff. But it's strikingly modern. And the interventions that Hamilton executes are even more modern. So going through all the records and literally piecing together price series based on the listings in the newspapers day by day by day by day was something I wouldn't really wish on my worst enemy, but great nonetheless. But a very, very, very important episode that few people actually know about.
That is super interesting. Well, we're going to come back to Alexander Hamilton, but I think it's a natural segue to talk about your financial crises course. Now, this is a course you started teaching with Bob Bruner, who we've talked about here, but tell us about this course.
Yeah, it's my baby. It's probably one of the favorite things I get to do in my entire career. I truly love it. So essentially the course is predicated on the notion, on my belief at least, and I think it's backed up by the evidence, that big changes we see in either societies or political systems, but certainly economic shifts tend to come, not always, but they tend to come after episodes of great financial or economic distress. The way I describe them is they are the elbow joints of history. You may have movements, but then something tends to break in the economy or financial system. And because that is the one thing that touches everyone in a society, that tends to cause shifts. And that can either be a very good thing. So, for example, after the Depression of the 1780s in the United States, you have the creation of the American Constitution and the fundamental change of the way the American economy works. But then also, it was a financial crisis that caused the French Revolution, and the whole raft of beheadings that happens in Paris. And you could also argue that it was a series of financial crises that really emboldened the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s. So these are the pivot points. And so the goal of the class is to help students understand them, because the statistics say that they will come into and deal with at least one and most likely multiple of these during their career. And the problem is that people they are shrouded in myth, and people tend not to really understand what they are and how they work. So the goal is to, at the barest of minimums, okay, this is how these things tend to work, and then provide a raft of episodes that you can draw on because they are different and they do kind of play out different. And if you are essentially assuming that something is going to operate in one way, but it ends up going another, you can make a series of really bad decisions. And so the goal is to help people understand both how they work, but also as a future business leader, how to manage your way through these. We look at a series of decision makers who are both government officials, but also leaders of companies and firms dealing with these crises. And so to try to help them understand, okay, in these crisis situations, this is how you need to prepare. Here's how you need to act. Here's how you need to lead your firm or your agency. But then finally is to understand how these affect broader society, right? Because these are linchpins of how political systems and societal systems move. So it is a connective tissue for, it's not just the economy and the financial system kind of works over here, and then politics and society kind of go along autonomous of that. It's here's how decisions made in finance and economics can fundamentally shift how the rest of this goes.
How do you structure a course like this? Because there's so many financial crises you could potentially talk about. So how do you decide which ones to talk about?
Oh, that's a good question. So the structure of the class is we deal with, it's a little bit unique in terms of Darden. So most of Darden classes are on the quarter system. So that's around 14 classes-ish. This is a 2-quarter class. So it's a full semester course, which is quite rare at Darden. So what we do is we look at 22 crises across 300 years. So we start in 1719 and come up to the most recent one we do is 2022-23 in Sri Lanka. And across those 22 crises in 300 years, I think we deal with 8 or 9 countries. I can't remember the exact number, but it's somewhere in there. Western countries, non-Western countries. And so my goal in terms of picking which ones to address is to give the students a sense of the different types of crises, because there are a lot of very different ones that have different kind of structures, have different catalysts, have different kind of paths as the crises emerge and go on. And then different resources to deal with them, because you don't exactly know like how well prepared you're going to be going into one of these. So some of them, I like to put the students in situations where those having to deal with the crises are really well prepared. Some of them where they are not prepared in any way, shape, or form, because there's a chance that you could be in both situations.
You have a favorite crisis? Do you have a favorite crisis to teach?
Favorite? Yeah. So I'd give a couple of answers to that. The first is there is always something going on in the world where there is, the classic line from Mark Twain, and whether he said it or not is questionable. But the quote supposedly says, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. And so we can kind of see the rhyming all over the place. And so almost literally every year, there is something going on in the world that has very close linkages to something in the past. And this last year is actually a fantastic example. There was a very large crisis and then subsequent depression in much of the world, but this case is centered on the United States after 1873, so the end of the 19th century. And that has always been one I keep in there because it has some interesting technical components. But with the AI and data center build out that has really come to the fore over the last year, I mean, it's been going on before that, but this is when people have been talking about it and getting a little concerned about it. the corollaries between the railroad build out and the kind of heavy capex front end investment that went into the railroad build out in the United States and the subsequent effects and crisis that came out of that was eerily similar. And so there are always classes like that, and it tends to be a different one every year where it kind of rhymes with what we are dealing with in the world right now. So that's always interested and timely. But if I'm thinking about other cases that are really kind of fun and interesting to teach, one of the ones that I would say is the hardest, but I really think it's important for students to do, is we do a case on the financial crises, the banking crises of 1931 and the rise of fascism in Germany. And the people tend to look at me when I tell them about this, but the decision point in the case is you are Hindenburg, who is the president of Germany, and you have to make a decision about whether or not to appoint Adolf Hitler as chancellor of Germany. Now, I want to be very, very clear and very specific about this. I always tell them up front, this does not mean that we are having any sympathy for that utterly monstrous regime that came into play. But it is important. In fact, I would argue in today's world, it is vital to understand how a non-monstrous person and group of people would be willing to make that choice. We tend to, in today's world, be like, I can't imagine how they would do that. How could they not see? And the problem is when we just dismiss these types of decisions as ridiculous, monstrous things that we could never make, that then deadens us to the potential that we could make really bad decisions as well. And so for me, this case is really important, not in any way because I think that it was a good situation to be in. I tell my students, and this is true, if my great grandfather had tried to leave Germany a couple of months later than he did, the bloodline would have ended there. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So it's personal for me in that respect. But I do think that it is vital for us to be able to understand why and how people make really, really terrible decisions. And then we can use that as guidance for not making those same sets of decisions again. And year after year after year, I mentioned that we're going to do this case at the beginning of class and students' eyes get kind of big. And year after year after year after year, in the course reviews at the end, students say that was one of the most impactful things I will ever do in my education. So it's difficult case. It's not easy, but it is what I believe education is all about. And it's absolutely and totally worthwhile.
Yeah, we got a question here in the Q&A about all right, so you're talking about really big historical events, right? The financial crisis of 1873, the investment in railroads, all this kind of stuff. How do you, first of all, create a decision for students in this case discussion that they have to make one way or the other? And then how do you unpack all of this information? Is there a framework that you typically use, a structure that you like to take for these conversations?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the things that we do, that is the point of this course, is to equip students to be able to unpack, break down, and analyze these massive things. Because, and I am a massive fan of Darden's kind of core curriculum. But one of the things that happens in education is we kind of specialize and drill down and we isolate. So you will take, 2 quarters of GEM, global economics and markets. You will take accounting, you will take finance, but in the real world, these things all bleed into each other. You're not going to be able to say, okay, sorry, I need to segment all these other things out and simply focus on the accounting question. Other things will bleed into this, whether you like it or not. And so part of the goal of this class is to give students the ability to break these down, to understand the different dynamics and then provide them strategies for how to kind of prioritize and then catalyze action. And so there are a lot of different kind of things that we go into in the class in particular. Some of them are a lot more tactical. And so, for example, is if you are dealing with a situation with a lot of your counterparties are in financial distress, how do you best evaluate them to tell whether they're illiquid or insolvent? Because these are two very different things and they have very different courses of action to follow them. But they can make the difference of the life and death of your firm, right? And so being able to separate all the noise, be able to isolate the variables, and then be able to determine illiquid and solvent. Okay, if it's illiquid, you do this. If it's insolvent, you do that. That is a significant portion of this. But then a lot of it is evaluating like ex post. Okay, you're getting hit by 17 things at once. What are the things that you have to prioritize, do by 8 a.m., by 10 a.m., by noon, by end of day? What can be put off until Thursday? What can be put off until next week? What do you have to front load? That kind of a thing. And so it's very kind of skill oriented, but it's choosing individuals based on the research that had to deal with these different types of issues. And then the students are put in the decision point of very real people who had to make these, sometimes successfully, and sometimes not.
Well, your comment about the railroads and AI got some people's attention here on the session. So it's very interesting. Thinking about the parallels, of course, people bring up the railroads a lot and the massive infrastructure investment and all of that. I'm curious, how do you think about the parallels here? Because when I think about the railroad development, I also think of like massive public resistance to the railroads. Like we don't ride on the railroads ride on us. These kinds of things that you've heard through history. Oh yeah. Yeah, curious to hear your thoughts on parallels, some thoughts you might have about AI and what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, there are always parallels. I think that I tend to be, so my wife says that when things are bad, you're the most optimistic person in the world. And when things are good, you're the most pessimistic. So I think like the having the broader historical perspective tends to equilibrate things. So the one thing I'll say as far as the railroads is I think that people discount how massive that change was for the people of the time. Especially, I've heard a lot of people saying, yeah, the railroads are a big deal, but AI is going to change the world. Railroads changed the world. I mean, the way I always frame it is here in the US, before the railroads, if you wanted to go from New York to California, it would take you 6 to 9 months. You would probably die along the way and die a very terrible death. And even if you made it, the odds that you would get there unscathed with anything on your back is very, very low. The railroads come along and you can make that trip in relative comfort in a week. That is earth-shatteringly different. And so that's not to say that AI is not important. Of course, it's important, but it's to say that I do think that we discount things that we are familiar with in terms of how important they are, and then discount them compared to things that we are not familiar with, and thus say that the things we're dealing with now are unprecedented, which they rarely ever are. As far as the AI build out, my concern is twofold. The first is, it is true that as much as the AI infrastructure build out is very large, the percentage of GDP that was spent on railroads is, depending on what calculations you use, 2 or 3 times that. And so like, we're not even approaching that on the AI build out. The one thing that really does make me nervous, however, and I've said this in a couple of forums previously, is that people who are simply equating railroads or like the fiber optic cable of the .com era as a similar type of thing, I think is a little bit misguided. And because if you think about railroads or fiber optic cable, there is kind of some baseline maintenance that you can do, but that is a fundamentally fixed cost upfront investment that you can essentially amortize the cost over time. You got to pay for upkeep. If somebody cuts through a fiber optic cable or blows up a rail line, like you got to fix it. But you are not replacing the rails every 3 years or so. Depending on what figures you look at in the AI build out, the chips that make up, 60-70% of the actual cost of the data centers will need to be replaced every 3 years, 4 or 5 years, 6 years, if under some estimates. And so essentially what that does is that converts what in for railroads or fiber optic cable was an upfront fixed investment that you can amortize over a long period of time to essentially a variable cost that you are going to have to continue to plow money into in order to stay kind of at the cutting edge. And so what that does, if it's a variable cost, no longer a fixed cost, that means that the amount of money you're going to have to charge in order to make that financially viable is going to be way higher than they are paying or than they are charging people right now. And if AI models continue to proliferate, then the question is, how are you going to create enough of a moat if you have to charge these high of levels in order to actually prevent people from not going elsewhere and losing your customer base? And then obviously, if you lose your customer base, then you're not able to charge and you're not going to be able to pay off that investment on the front end or on the variable cost. So I do see a real difference there. And that's something that people who are kind of drawing the similarities are not really accounting for a whole heck of a lot. We could talk about this much, much more. I have lots of thoughts on this, but I think that there's a similarity, but also some very key differences too.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I want to talk about your Alexander Hamilton course. So we referenced it. So Alexander Hamilton, Lessons in Strategy, Management, and Leadership. Must be interesting to teach an Alexander Hamilton course at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson University, so to speak. These two folks were at odds with one another in American history.
Oh, they were very at odds. Hamilton called Jefferson a man of scattered and sublimated imagination, who had no sense for good taste or good government. And Thomas Jefferson said that Alexander Hamilton was the new Caesar who was going to subvert the Republic. So you definitely had no love lost between those individuals. What I will say though, is you have to understand both of those guys to understand Americans and America today. Is the way I like to say it is we are a Hamiltonian country with a Jeffersonian spirit and brain. And so, this causes a lot of cognitive dissonance in a lot of ways. But yeah, I do think that if our dear founder, Mr. Jefferson, realized that a course on Alexander Hamilton was being offered at his university, he would be a bit nervous, to say the least.
Well, what was the inspiration for this course?
So it was the inspiration was, I've been really interested in Hamilton actually for a long time, even before I got into financial and economic history, and mostly because of his backstory more than even anything else. For those of you who are not aware, Alexander Hamilton was kind of one of our main founding fathers here in the United States, but unlike any of his peers, he was an immigrant. He was born very, very, very poor to an unwed mother in the West Indies, and at the time that was about as big of a social stain as you could possibly get. He immigrated to the United States at the age of 14 and began like a rocket ascent that resulted him in not that long being one of, if not the most powerful people in the country. And I was just very, very compelled by his story. But in my current role, Hamilton offered a series of lessons and circumstances that I believe that Darden students could really learn from for a couple of reasons. One, he had to deal with a very specific set of economic, financial, and strategic problems that even a lot of other kind of historical figures did not. So, in my mind, it wouldn't make sense to have a lot of classes like this at a business school. And I am very, very proudly at a business school. But Hamilton's task of reforming, operating, and guiding economic and financial system that was new, that was and operated in many ways like a startup. I mean, I'm not trying to be cute when I say that. Like a lot of students, when they take the class, they're like, these are like all the lessons that we talk about in our entrepreneurship classes of how to like run and operate a startup. There were adequate lessons there to be learned, kind of in a technical sense, from Hamilton. But also, the other thing that I think is super important is Hamilton had a lot of failings too. And one of the things that I absolutely adore the case method. I am a true blue believer. I will never do anything else. But one of the potential pitfalls we have is only showing the victories, like the winners. And Hamilton had a lot of wins. He was quite brilliant and did some really amazing things. But he also had some gargantuan failures. And I think that it is important for students to see somebody who I believe, and I use this phrase very rarely, was truly brilliant and did truly great things that reshaped the United States and the world, but also, man, made some catastrophic decisions. And I think Darden students can learn from both of those.
I'm so intrigued by the catastrophic decisions that Alexander Hamilton made. Can you tell us about one of them that maybe you talk about in the class?
Oh yeah. So we do a case, and it is a case on crisis public relations management. So the PR crisis that Alexander Hamilton found himself in is he was the central figure in the first sex scandal in American history. Long story short, he conducted a long-term affair with a woman named Mariah Reynolds. Her husband found out and began bribing Hamilton. Hamilton paid him for a long time, and then the guy sold his story to Hamilton's political enemies, saying not that he was having an affair with his wife and he was paying hush money, but that he was paying the guy money to essentially use insider trading information to game the system that Hamilton created. And that would have destroyed all kinds of confidence and all that kind of thing. So instead of dealing with this problem like a sane human being, Alexander Hamilton decided to go public and wrote a 90-page account of the affair in intimate detail. And when I say intimate detail, I mean that quite literally, and published it for the world to see. So it didn't satisfy his enemies. They were loving this because he was setting himself on fire. He lost a lot of credibility. And it is a textbook case of what not to do in crisis PR. And so in this is one of the cases that we do. I co-wrote it with some of the communication specialists here at Darden. And we bring in a couple of guest speakers as well who have done this in crisis situations for major companies. And we see, okay, rule number one, don't do what Hamilton did. Rule number two, here's how you should think about when you inevitably deal with everything from One of our guest speakers was the PR chief at Equifax when there was the hack, and hundreds of millions of social security numbers were spilled on the internet. How do you think about and deal with this type of PR crisis? And then what are some good rules of thumb when you think about managing a PR crisis? Do you do in that situation?
90 pages.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Terrible.
Okay.
Oh my God.
That's fascinating. So the exam for this course really got my attention because the students engage with an AI, Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah. Yeah. So, long story short, with AI being what it is, I do think it is an important tool, and I do think we need to bring it into the classroom as much as possible. And to be very honest, I have lost a lot of confidence in my ability to tell the mean exam from a student to an AI. So I can tell the really good ones if they're written by a student or AI. I can tell the really bad ones, but that big fat part of the distribution, I've lost all confidence. It's a crapshoot. So I tried to think about, okay, what would be a good exam in the world of AI? And I thought back to in grad school in history, you have to do these things called oral exams, where you essentially read hundreds of books and articles, and then you sit in front of a panel of three or four professors for 3 or 4 hours, and they essentially just grill you. Um, and it was a terrifying experience, but it was also one of the best of my career. Um, and so I didn't want to necessarily be the one to do this. I thought that Alexander Hamilton should be the one who they engaged with. So I worked with the amazing team here at Darden, Fred Talegdi, who's on our team here at Darden. He actually might be right outside the studio here, as a matter of fact. Um, Amazing guy. And we worked together for about 9 months to build an AI Alexander Hamilton, and we spent insane amounts of time on it. I feel pretty good about it. He lives right here on my phone, so if we had time, the world could speak to him. But the assignment was that the students had to discuss, they had to talk to this Alexander Hamilton for 20 to 30 minutes and critique one or more of his policies. And so uh, the it could be any policy you wanted, but over time, having gone through the entire class, my hope was you would see his errors and be able to really engage with this, and it was remarkable. But then the second element was they had to take a step up the ladder, so to speak, and actually critique the model. And so it's not just looking at like a debate between people, entities, whatever. But it's also being like, oh no, like the model is wrong. Like Hamilton would not have reacted that way when I critiqued him on this. Oh no, I know that he actually had this view as opposed to that one. And if you have the knowledge where you can actually like appropriately critique an AI model, that shows me that you get the guy and the situations he went through. So it was an amazing experience. We're already working on making it a face-to-face, effectively a Zoom exam with Alexander Hamilton next year, which is terrifying and wonderful at the same time. But yeah, it was a great experience.
That's awesome. And I think you said 20, 30 minutes, but many of the students went longer than that, maybe even
Yeah,
plus.
absolutely. I actually did the math on this a few days ago because somebody asked me. The average exam was an hour and 10 minutes. I only require them to do an hour and or 20 to 30 minutes. And the average was about an hour and 7 minutes because students were so kind of into it, which shocked me. But hey, that's fantastic.
That's awesome. Well, in our last 10 minutes, I want to talk about UVA's Democracy and Capitalism,
Mm.
a lab that you co-lead as part of the Karsh Institute here. Gosh, I can't think of two topics that are more in the news these days: democracy, capitalism. Can they still work? Do they work together? Are they complementary? I mean, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I believe that they not only can work, but they're essential for each other. Um, the way my one of my co-directors, Sid Milkas, who's in the politics department, he has a good phrase where he says, capitalism provides democracy with resources, and democracy provides capitalism with legitimacy. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. The goal of the lab is to understand the intersection, both the synergies between free markets and free people, but also the tensions between them, and they both exist. Um, but if we are to remain uh, people, both in the American context, but hopefully around the world, who are free and prosperous, we need to understand the relationship between these things, acknowledge the conflicts, and uh, do everything we can to find ways to integrate them more fully. And I think that's one of the things among many that we're doing.
It does feel like democracy here at home in the United States, around the globe, is a bit at an inflection point. You certainly see more right wing parties gaining traction, authoritarian regimes gaining
Yep.
traction. Um, what do you make of this? What do you think about this?
Yeah, this is where I think being a historian helps a little bit. So I do this exercise when talk on this subject with undergrads. So in my office upstairs, I have this rope that's 55 feet long, approximately. And at the very end of one of them, it's about 2, 3 inches from the end, I have a little blue ribbon and tied it. And what I'll do is I'll go up to the classroom, I stretch the rope out across the entire front, and I ask the students, like, okay, well, what is this rope and what's the ribbon? And there's all kinds of things going on, but what they have essentially get to is the rope is essentially human history. Going back to when we walked out of caves. And then the rope, so all the way at the end, is not just like the American Revolution or the French Revolution. That's ancient Greece. And so the point of this is that for the entirety, virtually the entirety human history, mankind has been ruled by prophets, priests, or kings. And so we as a species are not yet familiar intrinsically with the idea that humans should have some say in who governs them. And as somebody who believes very deeply that humans should have agency in who governs them, this idea that we are so new to this should do two things. One, it should give us a sense of how valuable and unique this opportunity is, that we have the chance to not just be ruled by whoever is strongest, but also that this system is tenuous and that it can go away really quick. And so, you know, as I look at that and I think about what's going on in the world, it doesn't surprise me, because there is always the tendency toward mean reversion. And that in order to resist the mean reversion, as I believe we must, we have to work really, really hard, because we are not evolved to it yet. That doesn't mean that we can't be, and it doesn't mean that we should not be, but we have to fight tooth and nail to make sure that we do not go back to this kind of dog eat dog world where the powerful just rules the rich no matter what they say.
Interesting time to have that conversation, particularly as you have this widening disparity around the world. Here in the United States,
Mhm.
this idea of like, this capitalism work for everyone is definitely very much of this moment.
Yeah, I think so. I believe that it does, and I believe that that is an empirical fact. Now, there have been some research coming out. People will say like, "Oh, authoritarian capitalism can be a thing." Like you don't have to have democracy. And when I say democracy, I say that very widely. I don't mean specific democracy. We can talk about republicanism, parliamentarism, like some kind of free governance society. Um, but what the empirics show over time, if your capitalism begins to degrade, your democracy will too. And if your democracy begins to degrade, your capitalism absolutely will. So people look at like the last 5 years or even 10 years and be like, see, you can make it work. It's fine. Well, 10 years is the blink of an eye in human history. And so I would say I would challenge that from a theoretical perspective. And that doesn't mean that the systems have to be exactly like they are in the United States. There's lots of ways that can do this, but as long as you have these core kind of principles, um, the correlation, not to mention the causal mechanism between free societies and wealthy, prosperous societies are incredibly high, especially when you adjust for time.
Well, Scott, a couple more questions for you. Anything you're working on these days that you would want to talk about here?
Yeah. So the Democracy and Capitalism Lab, along with a partnership with the Institute on Business and Society that here at Darden, um, we are in the midst of a massive research program right now to build a global capitalism index. So this will be coming out later this year. And essentially, it measures how capitalist or how good at capitalism 176 countries across the globe are. This is broken down into 8 main categories of capitalism, all the way from property rights and private ownership to capital market sophistication, to market competition, to the free flow of goods and capital. The data goes back about 30 years, and we have, I think at this point, about 350 different data sets that go into this and goes through a technical process of determining weights and all that kind of stuff. So the Global Capitalism Index project is really cool, I think will have some really significant implications in a lot of arenas. And then the other thing is I am just finishing up the edits for a book that will come out in the fall. It's on early American economic development. So this is the early Americanist in me. And essentially it is called, or will be called, The Revolutionary Origins of American Economic Power. And it essentially lays out my argument for how the American economy became American as opposed to colonial and British. And it really frames the United States in what it was at the time, which is a capital and labor poor, resource rich, post colonial developing economy. We have plenty of those in the world today. And the corollaries between the United States at that time, which we tend to dismiss now because the United States is the biggest economy on earth or whatever, is strikingly appropriate and relevant today. So those are the 2 things I'm spending a lot of time on, but there's all kinds of other fun stuff going on here.
All right, Scott, last question. Same last question we asked for all of our guests here on Office Hours. For folks who gotten intrigued by the topics today, we talked about a lot. And I'm curious if you have a few book recommendations for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was thinking about this. So the first one, for those who are kind of interested in that combination of democracy and capitalism and the early American piece, there's a book called Creating the Commonwealth by a former UVA historian called Stephen Innes. It's called Creating the Commonwealth, The Economic Culture of Puritan New England, and essentially lays out how the Puritans, so the early New England settlers, reconciled that tension between democracy and capitalism. They realized that it exists, and they actually were incredibly capitalistic. But they also realized the tensions. And so this book really goes into how they kind of embraced those tensions, sat between them, and tried to reconcile them. It's an amazing book. I give it to people as gifts all the time. The second one I would recommend, especially for people overseas, is a famous book called Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. It was written in 1837. Tocqueville was a Frenchman who came over and traveled around the United States for years, and then wrote this book for people back in France trying to explain this new republic. And it is shockingly prescient. I think it understands America and Americans better. And he wrote it back in 1837, better than anything that's written today. You read it today and you're like, wow, did he write this yesterday? This is unbelievable. So it's a classic and it's long. Read the abridged version. That's fine. But it's a remarkable book. And then the final I think I'd recommend is one of my favorites. And it's a book called City, by a guy named Douglas Ray, R-A-E. And it's essentially a history of New Haven, Connecticut. And a colleague, when I went to Yale, gave it to me just so I could kind of understand the city that I was living in. But what was amazing about it is a story of the rise and fall of industrialization in America. And it's one of the most remarkable, interesting books. I mean, in some cases, he goes back and does research and goes block by block, what shops were on what streets and how kind of that influenced the broader New Haven economy and what reforms were made that actually led that to go wrong. So it's very colorful. It's very rich. But it also gives a very interesting sense of how industrialization kind of rose in the United States and then how it actually declined over time. So those three books are probably the three I'd leave everybody with.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. This conversation was a real treat. And to our listeners and attendees, thank you so much for being here. These office hour sessions, I think, are a great way to meet the faculty, learn a little bit more about them, but hear what they're passionate about, what they're researching about, what they're teaching in their classes. Hopefully that gets you interested in the learning experience here at Darden. We'll be back in March with a conversation with Justin Hopkins, a member of our accounting faculty. We have conversations lined up for the next few months, so hopefully we'll see you again soon. But Scott, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Have a great day, everybody. Have a nice weekend. And that was my conversation with Scott Miller, member of the faculty here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.